Let's talk about black and white conversion. If you know my work, you know I do a lot of black and white. And I thought I'd make a video outlining the process, my recipe for doing those conversions. I've got 4 examples I want to present and take you through that workflow today. Let's first, though, talk just briefly about where in my workflow I do these conversions. So I have a video out there that talks through my workflow from front to back. The point I want to mention here is I do my black and white conversions last. That and crop are the last things I do before I output to JPEG. So I do it at the end for ease of file management. All the variants pull from the same PSD file, and if the client has a request for rework, I open up the Affinity file, make the change, re-export the PSD, and all of the crops and adjustments propagate through. So I find that really handy. All right, so let's talk about the basic black and white conversion steps. There's 4 steps that I use. First one is desaturate, and I use the saturation tool in Capture One under the exposure tab. I know they have a black and white tool that has multiple sliders based on color. I don't use that. I then add contrast, and I really push the contrast, and I use 3 main tools for this: the mid-tone point of the levels, curves, and the clarity tool, just to add a little bit of grit. I then recover the shadows. This is my black point, and my tools I typically use here are the black point on the levels and the Hdr shadow recovery. And then I adjust my white point. This is really the art of the whole process. There's 4 tools I use. It's never really the same. White balance, there's 2 sliders that control all of your colors. The white point on the levels, HDR for recovery or pushing the whites, HDR again for recovery or pushing the highlights. The first 3 steps you'll see as I go through these 4 examples are largely prescriptive. I do the same things. There might be subtle differences here and there, but for the most part, it's a recipe, rinse, repeat, you're good to go. The last one, though, is highly subjective. I move things around. I'm looking for a balance between these 4 sliders. Sometimes I use all 4, sometimes I only use 1. It's really dependent on what it is that I am looking to achieve in the final image. That's it. Let's now move into Capture One, and I'll run 4 images through this recipe, and you could see it happen live. All right, so we're in Capture One now, of course, and this is Callista. This is the image at the end of my retouching process. You can see it's a PSD file. And I've got the crop on it, just the crop that I like. And let's take this image through a black and white conversion. So clone the variant, easy to do. Step 1, desaturate. This is the hardest step. There you go, you're done. Drag it to 0, and I do it there. I don't use the black and white tool. What I'm going to do, just as a compare, let's clone the variant again and just see the difference between, just the straight desaturate that a lot of people do is black and white, and the results we get from, the recipe. I've done this one before, so I've got my notes in front of me, and I'll just get to where I was, and I'll explain it briefly. By the time we get to the last one for Holly, the process is a lot more complex, but this conversion is actually quite simple. Right, so the step 2 of my process is to add contrast. Again, very formulaic. Push the midpoint on the levels. That'll really push the blacks. Offset the highlight by just using the default contrast luma curve. You can see that's one of the presets. And add a bit of clarity and structure. Again, these are my standard settings. And you're now done step 2 of adding contrast. Let's recover the shadows. This little magic wand here is pretty cool. I just use that. You can see my black point is increased from 0 to 2. That's fine, that's not a big choice. And now under Hdr Shadows, let's bring the shadows back up. So you can see, certainly in the hair, where I get some of that information back. And my black point is black, but there's a couple of points in there. I'm looking at these numbers up here, the RGB numbers. There's a couple of points that are still zeros, but I don't mind that. This looks quite good. Now we're at the step 4, which is where I now push my white point. I want black and white. I don't want grayscale. And I use the exposure warning tool. Anything red is, if you will, clipped. And you can see my background is 255 across the board. So that's obviously going to show a warning. What I'm worried about is where I show warnings on the skin tone. And this is where I get into white balance as my tool to push this. And I typically start with the Kelvin, and I'm pushing it, and you can see I'm gradually pushing it until I get almost too much on the forehead. That's where I'm looking. And let's stop about there. I'm quite happy. And let's take a look at what it looks like. There you go. And this is where I ended this conversion for this particular shot. I didn't do any adjustments after this. So let's compare it. This is the straight desaturated version, and this is now the high contrast black and white. And there is a fair amount of difference in the skin tone. I don't mind pushing the whites. I find that contrast gives the pop that I'm looking for. So here's the color image that I would deliver, and here's the corresponding black and white. It seems a bit bright down here. I might bring that down a little bit, perhaps the highlights. I got to be careful because that's going to also bring back the white on the background a little bit. And yeah, that's good. I'm happy with that. All right, let's go to Neville. I've known Neville now for 37 years, and he was going for a real Jeff Goldblum feel, and I think we nailed that on this image. So let's clone the variant. Again, this is the end of a PSD file of a retouch. Let's go through my recipe again. Saturation down to 0. I'm going to copy it again just to prove once again the value of the high contrast. Run through my formula. Let's bring the midpoint down to -0.2. Let's add a contrast luma curve to pop it. Let's add clarity and structure. And we're now at the end of step 2, adding contrast. Let's recover the shadows a little bit. Let's just make sure my black point up here is good. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So recover the shadows. Really, it's the jacket now that I'm looking at here, right? These are where this is the texture I want to bring back. And yeah, I'm liking it there. And white balance again, let's bring it way up. Let's bring the exposure warning on. I'm going to see some action in that beard. And I don't want to push it too far, but I think that's good. I also notice in the histogram, you can see there's a peak, there's a spike right there. That is the background that's happening. You can see if I drag it, you can see where the cursor, you can see the line in the histogram correspond to where the cursor is. And you can see up here, this is the beard, this is where it's hot. You see them getting hotter. And then obviously the background is where the spike is. So I want to push this even a little bit more. And instead of using white balance, I sort of change tools and just play, and I'm going to bring it to about there. And that's roughly a good point. Finding a lot of the highlights are blown. So in that case, I'm going to bring the highlights back down a little bit. But I like the contrast that the white point change in the levels made. And that's where I ended up leaving this image and the image I delivered. So again, let's compare to just the straight up desaturated version, which is there. And you can see the pop. And I haven't really changed. If you look down here, I haven't really, the net effect isn't much different other than I brought out some of the textures. And again, I compare the color in the black and white, and I get the same set of feel to it. That's important. Okay, so this is Michael, and it's more of a standard crop that you would typically see in the work that the headshot crew does. It's step 1, obviously, is to clone the variant, and saturation down to 0. Formulaic steps, -0.2 in the midpoint. Curve, contrast, luma, 10, 10. Right, we've now done the first two steps, desaturate and add contrast. The recovery on the black point of the shadows is interesting on this one because I have now a gray background. And if I use the Kelvin slider too much, you can see I'm going to start bringing a bit more into the background than I want. So I'm going to do a little bit less on the Kelvin. Where was I? Where was the default? I started at 5,000. Yeah, so let's bring it up just a bit. Let's go to 6,000. But I will bring the tint down, and that gets me going where I want to go. That's pretty cool. At this point, I want a bit more pop on the white, so I will bring this back down, maybe about there. I've burnt it off too much, so let's bring the highlights back down with HDR, maybe to there, so I don't get as much clipping. And that's where I would end the image. So I've got from there to there. I didn't put the desaturated one, so why don't we do that very quickly as a compare. So clone the variant, drag it over to there, and just desaturate this one. Right, so that would be the typical grayscale that you would get, and we've gone from there to there. So you can see the pop. I've darkened the shadows, and I've really made his highlights and his skin pop, and that sort of defines what my black and whites are like. You're probably getting bored with this, so let's move to a more complicated one. This is Holly. I photographed her in September when we were looking at the Peter Lindbergh portrait probe in the headshot crew. And I was always drawn to his image of Nicole Kidman that he did as part of his Pirelli calendar series shortly before he passed away. And I wanted to see if I could recreate his black and white processing. Let's start, as we always start with, clone the variant. Let's bring the saturation down to 0. Let's clone it again just so we can compare the difference that we're going to get off of the, what people typically use as black and white. All right, so the standard starting point, levels to minus the midpoints down, clarity's down. The curve that we normally apply, contrast luma, you can see it really pushes the image too far. This is more the pop that I like, but was not consistent to where the image that I was trying to recreate the feel from. This is too much contrast for that. So how I ended up managing that, I took the curve off, so it's back to where it was. I add a layer, an adjustment layer. Let's call it curve. Let's fill that layer and then put the curve in there. What advantage this gives me is I can now change the opacity. And let's bring it, I think it ended up around 20. There you go. So you can see I've brought just a bit more contrast into the image. I've lowered the blacks a little bit. I've brought the whites up a little bit. The midtones are up a little bit. But I haven't pushed it as far as I would normally for my own work. Okay, so now let's do the black point. Go back on the background curve. Let's automatically adjust the histogram, so I compress it. Again, that gives me my, let's use the full range that we've got. I'm going to bring the white point back up because I don't want to do that, but by pushing the magic wand, I've brought the black point up to where it should be. And now let's recover some of the shadows. Let's go. I don't want to do too much. Yeah, that's good. There, so that's my shadows. The white point now is where we can spend a lot of time. And I remember when I first did this image, I must have spent half hour, 45 minutes trying to figure out the right combination of the 4 levers that I've outlined. So I will just go to there as opposed to take you through that half hour, 45-minute process. For the white balance, I ended up going the other way. I ended up going all the way down just to bring a little bit lightness overall to the image. And I brought the tint down as well. And you can see this has a global effect about there, raising the overall brightness of the image, which was more consistent with his work. I'm still not using the full histogram. I've got a flat piece here. So let's bring that over. And if I put my exposure warnings on, you can see I've started blowing out some of my highlights. Again, that's not consistent with the Lindbergh results that I were going after. So I ended up bringing my highlights down to about there. So this, now I've got all that texture information in there, which is wonderful. I'm still blowing her nose out a little bit. So I'm going to bring my white point down just, actually it's going to be a fair amount. That's enough. Let's take that exposure warning off. And that's roughly where I finished this image. So let's compare it to just the straight up desaturated version from there to there. So you can see I've really brought the freckles out. And that's what I was going for. I know I went to this recipe very quickly. Trust me, the first time I did this, it took much longer. So I hope you found that useful. The first 3 images were more my standard style, the high contrast, make the whites pop. The last one was a bit more complicated. I thought I'd show you that anyways, just to give you another example and that trick of putting the curve in a fill layer. But this is my standard process. 4 steps. The 4th one is where this is where you could spend some time. But once you get the recipe for that session, it just becomes a copy paste to the other ones. So, yeah, hope you found this useful, and be sure to write comments in the bottom if you have any questions. And thanks for watching.